Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk about History Channel's hit TV show, Vikings. Now, there are currently 59 episodes of Vikings, so to talk about the historical accuracy of the entire series is sadly not plausible. It'd just take too much time away from adult stuff I have to do, like go to work, pay taxes, and knit. It took me an entire year to make this scarf and now I'm too scared to wash it. So I'm going to focus on Vikings' portrayal of the Old Norse religion, how it's discussed, the rituals that we see depicted, what's real, what's made up, and how we know that. Quick disclaimer, I am not a historian, I just have a history degree because my university needed a solid gold library or something. Also, this is a very broad topic, so if you are interested in learning more about Norse mythology and the Old Norse religion, I will be putting my sources and further reading materials at the end of the video. There are two parts to this analysis. The first is theology, which will focus on the gods, creation, and all that fun metaphysical stuff. The second is ritual, which is going to focus on the cult practices represented in the show. Vikings is set mostly in Norway and England in and around the late 8th century. And I say in and around because there's some real wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey, Jeremy-Bearimy stuff going on with the major events, making it hard to figure out the actual year the story's set in. Seriously, if real dates were used, you'd either have Ragnar the raiding newborn attacking Lindisfarne, or Ragnar the mildly confused geriatric attacking Paris. And while I might find both of those things entertaining, the objective value of watching a newborn strangle a medieval monk with its own umbilical cord would probably be lost on most of society. One of the most important things to understand when studying this region and time period is that 8th century Norway wasn't widely literate. Although there were runes, they weren't commonly used or understood, and so much of what we know about the Old Norse religion was recorded after the Christianization of the Scandinavian people. One of the most extensive sources we have is the 13th century prose Edda, or Snorra Edda, a collection of Norse mythological stories presumably passed down through oral tradition in Iceland. This is where we find the stories of Thor, Odin, Freyja, the Norse creation story, Ragnarok, and other well-known Norse myths, many of which we see referenced in Vikings. I won't go into the myths specifically, as this video is more about their history, but there are other videos you can check out that do a good job of explaining them, and I'm also going to have some readings listed at the end of the video. The prose Edda was likely written or compiled by a man named Snorri Sturluson, a 13th century Icelandic poet and bureaucrat. Snorri is also the author of the saga Heimskringla, which we'll hear more about later. Now you might be thinking, we have this big book of Norse myths. That must mean we know everything about Norse mythology, right? Well, if you're thinking that, you're wrong, dicko. We've gained a lot of knowledge from the prose Edda, but because of the nature of its creation, we can't wholly say that it's an accurate portrayal of Old Norse religious beliefs. Apart from the broken telephone aspect of passing stories down through the centuries, medieval Christians weren't exactly known for their unbiased and tolerant opinions of other religions. We have no way of knowing how the stories changed, whether intentionally or unintentionally, between when they were recorded and when they were actually used in religious practice. Further, there were various groups living in Scandinavia, not just one big amorphous blob of Vikings, as TV and movies often portray. Now is the time when I tell you that my use of air quotes over the word Viking is because I'm a history snob, and all good history snobs must at some point out that Viking does not denote a people. Viking denotes a job. To go Viking is to go raiding and pirating. Most of the Scandinavian people were not Vikings. They were actually farmers. The more you know. So yeah, Scandinavia didn't necessarily have a homogeneous culture or religion, and on top of that, we can't really discount the fact that Christianity would have influenced how Snorri recorded the stories. I mean, the prose Edda opens with a Christian story that references the biblical flood, for Freyja's sake. So in summary, while we do know a bit about the Norse religion and we do know about some of their gods, we don't exactly have a comprehensive understanding of Old Norse religious beliefs. So now what about the religion in practice? Along with the Edda, we get more information from a collection of works known as the sagas, histories of famous figures like Ragnar Lothbrok. But these were also recorded long after their creation, and neither the sagas nor the prose Edda were particularly concerned with recording historic religious ritual. The sagas were recorded by medieval Christians who wanted to preserve their ancestor stories, not their scary pagan religious practices like cutting down a tree in midwinter, bringing it inside, and decorating it for Yuletide feasts with your family and friends. You know, nothing scary like that. When religious practice does come up, it comes up incidentally, like in the saga Heimskringla. That's why we know about Odin and Thor and Freya, but we don't necessarily know as much as we'd like about how they were worshipped. Our knowledge of Norse religious practice comes from two main sources: incidental information from literature like the sagas, and from archaeology. There are some practices that we're fairly sure of. I'm going to look at three that we see in Vikings. Ship cremation. Ship cremation is something we see a lot in pop culture, especially as it relates to early medieval Scandinavia. In season 6, the shield maiden Lagertha is given one such lavish ship cremation. Worldly goods, animal sacrifices, and even a shield maiden are placed on a ship that is pushed into the sea and set ablaze. It's dramatic. There's fire, and it likely never happened like this. It would be extremely hard to cremate a body this way. Bodies are really hard to burn. Don't ask me how I know. You simply wouldn't be able to generate enough sustained heat in that environment without modern fuel. Prior to Christian contact, historians believe that cremation was the primary funerary custom. This would have been done on some sort of pyre. Very wealthy people sometimes had their pyres placed on ships, but these ships would be on dry land. A more ordinary person might be buried in a small personal boat, or no boat at all if they were a scrub. Depending on when and where they were used, a grave boat or ship could contain the ashes or intact body of the deceased. Lagertha's funeral seems to have been heavily inspired by an account from Ahmed bin Fadlan, a 10th century traveler from Baghdad. His account of a chieftain's funeral describes the body being placed in a temporary grave while preparations were made. Next, a slave girl was asked to accompany her master. She got hella drunk and was subjected to a series of sexual rituals with men who may have been passing their life force on with her. She was lifted up 3 times and asked what she saw. The 3rd time she claimed to see her master beckoning to her in paradise where everything was green. Then she decapitated a chicken, because I guess, why not? The chieftain's ship was brought inland, and a bed was placed upon it, with the chieftain's body being laid in it. The girl was taken to the bed, and inconspicuous shields were inconspicuously beaten, so her inconspicuous screaming couldn't be heard. She was restrained and stabbed through the ribs by an old woman. When the burning was finished, a mound of earth was placed over the site. Now, grave goods weren't always burnt. Sometimes they were simply buried. Which makes a lot of sense. I mean, you wanted to send the deceased to the next world in style. A burnt boat and a bunch of broken pottery wouldn't make much of a statement, unless you were like Viking Lady Gaga and it was an art thing. At some point, intact burial became de rigueur, but even then, grave goods were still used. Lagertha's grave goods include a number of horses, weapons, an entire ship, chests of silver, wreaths, furs, a bed, and a crown. If they weren't all on fire by the time she got to Valhalla, she'd probably be set for a pretty sweet afterlife. Now, all these goods might seem excessive to us, but this is not too far off from the goods that are actually found in similar graves. From excavation sites like Vendel, we know that important members of society were buried with elaborate grave goods, including weapons, jewelry, good boys, and horses. Sometimes they were buried in or with ships, and sometimes the ships were simply representative. When real ships were buried, they were on average smaller than what we see on Vikings. Some of the places where people were buried with their grave goods are called mounds, and we see these almost everywhere that the Scandinavian people lived. These mounds are actually quite impressive. Radar used at the mounds at Bor reveal not only ships, but entire buried halls. That's right, no sleeping on Odin's couch for you. The Oseberg ship was excavated from a mound in Norway and contained the body of a high-status woman and her probable slave or servant. Now, the ship is absolutely massive. It's so impressive, and it was chock full of all kinds of archaeological goodies, grave goods, and I think it may have been the inspiration for Lagertha's funeral ship. It's really a shame that we don't see burial mounds more when we know that this was a funerary practice in the region in time, but I get why we don't. It's probably a lot more impressive to watch a boat on fire than to watch 6 sweaty guys digging a hole over 3 days. You know what? I think I'd watch that show. Animal sacrifice and ritual. Now, there is continual animal sacrifice throughout Vikings. In Season 3, Episode 3, a goat is killed and everyone gets to take a shower in its newly shed blood. When Lagertha gets her farm in Season 6, she does the same. There's more fun blood showering. In terms of how this ritual is portrayed in Vikings, the show is actually pretty accurate, at least as far as we know. We know that prominent members of society, including royalty, were involved in religious ceremony, just like Lagertha is. We also hear reference to blot, or animal sacrifice, in the saga Heimskringla, among others. In the saga Heimskringla, we find reference to Jol, or Yule, a feast where sacrifices were offered to Odin. Quick warning though, Heimskringla has a really heavy Christian bias, so take whatever you read in it with a big-ass grain of salt. They continually refer to practitioners of the Old Norse religion as heathens and call their gods idols, and they call people good for slaying a lot of pagan civilians. And he beheaded the heathen children and the heathen mothers and spilled their guts and exploded their heads and stepped in their blood and drank their blood, and thus was he a good Christian. Now, I have a lot of trouble pronouncing one of the words in this excerpt. See if you can guess which one. It was an old custom that when there was to be a sacrifice, all the bonds should come to the spot where the temple stood and bring them all that they required while the festivals of the sacrifice lasted. All kinds of cattle as well as horses were slaughtered, and all the blood that came from them was called portrayed, and the vessels in which it was collected were called portrayed vessels. Staves were made like sprinkling brushes with which the whole of the altars and the temple walls, both outside and inside, were sprinkled over, and also the people were sprinkled with blood, but the flesh was boiled into savory meat for those present. So yeah, considering that what we see on Vikings are smaller sacrifices and not huge festivals like Yule, the sacrifice of the animal with the obligatory blood spatter straight to the face is pretty accurate. What they do leave out is that the meat is boiled and consumed at a feast later, not wasted. So yeah, hashtag thrifty Vikings. References to blot are also made in, and for your entertainment I'm going to try and pronounce these without looking them up, and Hrafnhil's saga Freyskoa. Okay, now to the fun part, human sacrifice. Woo! We see memorable scenes of human sacrifice, including Season 6's sacrifice of Gyda and Season 1, Episode 8's sacrifice at Uppsala. In the first instance, a young woman is killed to accompany Lagertha to Valhalla. In the latter, several people are ritually sacrificed. Both are fairly accurate portrayals, at least as far as we know, and we actually have a lot of information on what happened in Uppsala, though again, it may not be reliable. The medieval chronicler Adam of Bremen documents events at Uppsala where the episode Sacrifice takes place. He notes that Uppsala is a sacred and revered place with a great temple. He describes the temple as having 3 great statues representing Thor, Odin, and Freya. There were also pools which may have been used for spiffy things like drowning. Adam of Bremen goes on to describe Blotkelda, or human sacrifice. Now, the number 9 seems to have spiritual significance, with the sacrifices taking place every 9 years and featuring the sacrifice of 9 types of 9 different species, including humans. The bodies of the sacrificed humans and animals were hung from trees to decorate a sacred grove, in possibly the worst iteration of the show Property Brothers. As for the priest questioning Athelstan's belief as a way of ensuring that the sacrifice was valid, I couldn't find any information validating that, so if anyone has any, please let me know in the comments. Now, the temple at Uppsala is something of a historical mystery since it actually hasn't been found. In the 1920s, archaeologists discovered a number of mounds that would support the site's importance, as well as some sort of wooden structure buried beneath a cathedral. But we have no idea if this structure was a hall, a temple, or just the world's shittiest Airbnb. In 2013, further excavations revealed what might have been support beams. This is very exciting for historians. For once, I'm not actually being facetious. It's really cool, guys. Separate from Adam of Bremen's account, Gjochuk's saga features an episode where Odin orders Starkjart to sacrifice his friend by hanging. It's a pretty story, so I recommend that you read it. Now, if we only took the sagas and Adam of Bremen's accounts alone, it'd be pretty hard to conclude that human sacrifice did happen. Again, because of the whole awkward medieval Christian bias thing. But, lucky for us, archaeological evidence also supports the practice of human sacrifice. Woo! In Lera, the bodies of 2 men were excavated. One was dressed to the nines, absolutely dapper. The other had a little less swagger because he was bound at the hands and feet and was decapitated. No hats for him. So yeah, the whole human sacrifice thing, accurate. Now, medieval Scandinavian history is not exactly my specialty, but I did have the opportunity to go to Stockholm and visit the Historiska Museum, as well as the Swedish Medieval Museum, and I even got to go to Uppsala. I got to look at grave goods, see a bunch of archaeology, try on this dress size for a large Scandinavian child. I would absolutely recommend, if you want to learn more about Vikings and Scandinavian society, you check out your museum for any local exhibits. If you are lucky enough to make the trek to Uppsala, don't make the same mistake I did and think that the mounds are right at the train station. Uppsala is actually a really big university town now, so if you're like me and you take the train there expecting to see mounds, you will be disappointed when you end up at the Swedish equivalent of a Denny's outside the train station. Really good lunch buffet though. You do have to take a bus from the train station. If you're like me, you'll take the wrong bus, go for an hour in the wrong direction because you don't speak Swedish and can't ask for directions, get back to the train station, get on another bus, and then get to the mounds long after the museum has closed. Still worth it though. Okay, that's it. Here are my sources and some further reading if you are interested in learning more. If you have anything you would like to see from my channel in the future, please let me know in the comments. I'm always excited to talk about pop culture and history.